What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of DM in the PM. My name's Tom Quinn, resident dungeon master here at Modern Myth, and today I am joined by a very special guest. Sitting down with me is Baron Ropp of Dungeon Masterpiece. What's going on, Baron?
Not a whole lot. Just it's not. I guess it is the PM where I'm at right now. As you can see, the sun is shining behind me.
That's more of a release schedule nomenclature, anyways. You know, we can record whatever we want. But,
I mean, it's fine. I release my videos in the morning and say good evening, Dungeon Masters. So
there you go. So you know how to play the game. You know how to play the game.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Well, right on, man. How's everything been going? I know you just crested your 1 year mark on YouTube. Congratulations for starters.
Thank you.
Both on surviving the year and not just surviving, thriving throughout the year. That's really exciting. I'm very happy to see that I'm not in the minority and enjoying your content.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I was just trucking along, you know, it was entirely just strictly something to do and, you know, a constructive hobby to fill my free time with, especially during the pandemic. But you know, I dropped a Hex Crawls video and it just went gangbusters out of nowhere,
really?
Totally left field. And then I had this old Faerun geopolitics video, and I swapped the thumbnail to look like the Hex Crawl video thumbnail.
Okay.
And once I did that, it also took off like crazy. And then the rest of my channel went nuts. Completely blew any expectations of what I had as far as like, you know, these are my goals. You know, I had benchmarks in my mind of like, you know, if I'm not reaching people by, you know, by certain numbers by this time frame, I'm going to quit because there's no reason in spending this much time in it if, you know, people aren't jiving. And I was on track, sure, but the amount of response that the community has given me is absolutely just mind-blowing. I'm shocked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's awesome. It like I said, it shows in your videos. I really had a hard time. Whenever I'm reaching out to someone to do one of these interviews, I like to approach them with a pretty concise representation of what it is I love about what they do. So I can say, this is kind of why I want to talk about XYZ subject. And I really think of almost everyone that I've talked to, I had kind of the hardest time articulating what it was about your content that just got its hooks into me. And after a while, I think I landed on two things. One, I don't think there's anyone, or I should say, if there's someone out there who thinks there is a more concise delivery of Dungeons and Dragons related content, maybe any content, period. I don't know what your average video length is, but the amount of content you are squeezing into a really small, neat package, I think is something that has gotten its hooks in me and many other people. But something else that really struck me about your content is so much of it, whether it was your intent in going into this endeavor or not, I think really spoke to kind of my roots in the more advanced D&D older edition space, a lot of the considerations that you're kind of bringing to the forefront. And I think for a lot of new tables, 5th edition tables, modern tables, really are considerations that have kind of, to some extent, fallen by the wayside as new editions of Dungeons and Dragons have unfolded. And I think that's what I was having such a hard time labeling, was you were speaking to a younger version of me who was, you know, enthralled and kind of discovering this game space and kind of how meticulous some of those considerations were in building these awesome worlds. And that kind of leads us right into the topic, I guess, which I think you've done a really good job of outlining on your channel, is the importance of grounding our tables, our game worlds, our narratives, our encounters, all of these things. That's something I think that you've done really successfully. Talk with me a little bit about, I mean, was there an intent going into it that be kind of a theme? And I guess, do you even agree that is kind of a theme throughout your content? I certainly think I have found that in your content, but I'd love to hear it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people do bring up in my content. And I think it's definitely a reflection of how I tend to run my RPG games. Like, for example, if you go and look up Troika, for example, beautiful rule set, it's hilarious on a cold read. I probably wouldn't ever run it, if that
Okay.
makes sense, just because it's so fantastical.
Yeah.
It's just so weird. Like, it looks like, what a bunch of college grad students who are studying, like, taking 500 level classes in game level design,
Yeah.
or something like that, or like game psychology. It's like they decided to rent a cabin together, drop some LSD, and write a rule set, right? Like, so, and that's totally cool, but it's not the kind of RPG that I like. The way my brain is wired,
Right.
that
Right.
I would find myself running. Um, and and that's not to say that those rule sets also are not grounded, if that makes sense. Like,
Okay.
take for example, look at what's the film? Uh, Thanks for All the Fish, with the jumping dolphins at the beginning, or Hitchhiker's Guide
Oh,
to the
Hitchhiker's Guide.
Galaxy,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah. Yeah.
or the books for that matter.
Yeah.
Hitchhiker's books. You know, it is an absolute slapdash rip roar course through a fantastical sci-fi setting.
Right.
It's just one amount of ad absurdum on top of another, but they do a really good job of, using the narrative as a tool in order to set up and ground everything that the player, or the players, that the audience or the reader needs to know, is already established early in the beginning. Like, you have a sense of grounding and a way to anticipate the absurdity of the universe. Like, you just know that it's going to be crazy, and you also kind of know what the rules of the crazy are going in. So
I really like that you touched on knowing what the rules of crazy are, and for this instance, we'll substitute crazy for fantastical, or
right.
Or sci-fi, or what have you. Certainly, I think an important lever to be pulled if you are instantiating crazy into your space is a crazy that people can understand. There's a structure to that crazy that allows an audience or a player or what have you to engage with that crazy in a grounded way.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's also something that how do I want to say this? So it's more of, you don't want to just throw the kitchen sink at the players, which, I mean, that sounds really, trite to say. That's a really obvious thing to say, but just do a good job in your first few sessions of establishing, what kinds of problems your players are going to be interacting with, and just let it rip from there. It honestly doesn't take much, and just understand that the world is a living, breathing place, unless it's just you're doing something like, an action RPG from the late 90s. Like, if you're wanting to play something that's like Diablo or MMO, like Guild Wars or something, like, the world is just a static thing and you drop your treasure and go kill monsters. That's fine too. But that can also be, it's kind of session zero stuff. Just have that expectations fully laid out.
Right. And so on that note, and kind of piggybacking off of the don't throw the kitchen sink at your players, and holding hands well with the idea that this is a living world. I guess let's let's hone in a little bit on the process maybe that we can employ, or at least thoughts that we can be keeping on in the back burner of our mind as we're building these worlds out.
Okay.
Ways in which we can ground them. And a couple videos really for me jumped out that you've done. And part of being concise, I know, means that there probably are times where you wish you could say more on a subject, and don't always have, if you're going to deliver it in such an impactful package the way that your videos do, sometimes there's fat that has to be trimmed, and you have to kind of get things real slim. But so maybe you can,
part of that is strategic for comment hooking, by the way. Like, I will reduce a concept that is only tertiary of a thing that I need to explain. If somebody could tell me that it needs to be its own video, I will sum it up in one sentence. That way I get people angry about it in the comments. So that's just parasocial engagement.
Playing the game.
Yeah.
Right on, man. But what immediately jumped out, if memory serves, it was actually the very first video of yours that that I watched, and it still, I think, might be my favorite video to date, which is an examination of Riven as a puzzle masterclass. And I think that, I mean, certainly in the context of puzzles, it delivers on that beautifully. But in the context of grounding our worlds, and just as you said a second ago, that these are living worlds that should be existing agnostic of whether the PCs are in that space at any given time or not. I think it really did a great job of outlining how dissemination of lore throughout your entire game world is kind of something of a puzzle in itself, even if it's not intended that they follow these specific clues and learn these things to get the solution.
Right.
You know, lore is out there to be discovered and is all the more meaningful when it's discovered, rather than me going like, hey, by the way, you missed something back there. Go turn that rock over. You're going to need this for later. You know, that doesn't fly so well, or I should say, as a DM, it doesn't feel good. And as players, it's far more meaningful if they, through clever DMing, found their way to that rock on their own. But that video, the Riven puzzle video, and a recent release about running mysteries, I think those hold hands really well, and things that we should be keeping in our mind when these worlds are being unspooled, that lore is a series of clues to be consumed to build a bigger picture, or I say a more concise picture of the world in which you are existing in, or the
100%.
space. But I wanted to give you an opportunity for either of those videos. Again, I know that with you being as concise as you are, I thought this might be a good format that if there were things about those spaces that you had more thoughts on, I would love to hear them, because like I said, that video spoke to me as a kid who lost years of his life to Riven. But
I think I played it for probably a year and a half.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest takeaway, as far as how to, and you definitely mentioned this, part of me is a bit lamentable that I can't be more academic and get the kind of engagement that I'd like to see out of a more academic video. You know, I don't want it to look like a college lecture, because nobody would watch it.
Right.
But honestly, you know, the lesson contained therein of that video, which is, you know, put lore everywhere and have it all interconnected. That's the only world built, like, that's the only video you need to watch. You know, I'm not trying to say, like, you know, go watch that particular video and then you'll be a great dungeon master, and also like put myself on a pedestal. That's not at all what I'm saying. But like that concept, that's all you need to know.
Right.
You know, you don't have to, you know, bury things under perception checks or anything like that. It's as your players bumble around. I even touch on this a little bit in my Hex Crawls video. As your players bumble around, they should bump into the things that add value to the narrative of your story. So even if it's entirely sandboxy and whimsical, and there is no like big bad ND, you know, thing at the far end, they're just, you know, kind of like an easy watching after work, you know, easy listening jazz video, you know, even if it's just something like that, and you're just exploring and you don't even have combat, you're just finding cool stuff and playing a game.
Right.
You know, you're just letting players explore.
Yeah.
That's all that it is. And adding and just connecting the web of information in the world together, so that as they explore, it becomes more complete.
Right. And I guess a follow-up question to that, because I mean, exploration really, I do think, is the pillar in which most of that lore, in that fashion anyways, is being disseminated. Certainly
100%.
You might have some, we'll call it social exploration, if they're grilling an NPC, or if they're, you know, there's other ways of disseminating it, but what are your thoughts? Because we've said a couple times on split screen D&D that I think modern Dungeons and Dragons has really elevated specifically the social pillar. And
you think it's elevated it?
I think when I say modern D&D, I think I'm talking a lot about actual play culture and some of
Right.
this, but I think the if anything, I would say that the exploration pillar in modern D&D has kind of had to stand in the shadow of the other two pillars, and that was not an experience that I typically found in older Dungeons and Dragons. Let's say pre-experience being gained via killing monsters Dungeons and Dragons,
Okay.
where there was a potential to garner the rewards of leveling and growing in experience as a player without ever engaging in combat at all, if you were
Right.
smart with the way that you. So I guess with that in mind, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because I know that there are many opinions on this. What do you think kind of
Right.
the current status of the various pillars of gameplay are, modern versus more of that old school gameplay?
So I'm how do I want to say this? I feel like it's a little bit of a fallacy to like illustrate some pillars of gameplay, like the pillar of exploration, the pillar of combat, the pillar of social interaction or theater or whatever. You know, like those are fun things to say we can pull levers on, right? But then uh I feel like it is a constraining understanding of what a game system actually has, and it how, how do I want to articulate this? I think it's a more healthy exercise to look at a rule set and identify like what is actually being discussed in the rule set.
Okay.
And with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, you have all of the character classes, sure, and the vast bulk of the abilities that the character classes and the races get, almost all of them revolve around combat.
Absolutely.
And then when you go and read the general rules, which is some 80 pages of actual content,
Right.
you have, some 76 of them, 77 of them are all about combat.
Right.
And then you have one half page, or rather a whole page with a half page bleed page on exploration, and not even 3 paragraphs on social interaction.
Right.
And you see um, that same kind of paradigm happen in the spell descriptions as well. You definitely do have more spell descriptions that focus on social encounters and whatnot, but because they are so overcrowded with combat abilities, that a lot of the spells that hypothetically would be used in social interactions end up getting used in combat situations.
Right. Oh,
So
that's fair. Absolutely.
or situations that are immediately before or after combat, as like, a handoff or a handshake too.
Right.
Like the
Right.
spell suggestion, for example, is basically a weak dominate person in combat. So um, you know, I think it's when you have a such a combat heavy system, what is really interesting to me is that 5th edition, really, it's if you go back and look at the original versions of, like, if you go look at BX, you go
Mhm.
look at AD&D 1, and even 2, 2nd edition for that matter, um, the amount of mechanics, and 2nd edition gets more squirrely with combat mechanics for sure, but it's nowhere near as much as it is in 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition.
Right. Right.
Um, and there's been a dramatic focus on building out the complexity of combat encounters in as we've progressed, and in some respects 5th edition definitely took it a step back, but the percentage of rules is very much focused on combat. And that's a really interesting thing to like look at the two sides of the same coin of, whereas people didn't focus on social interaction coming from, it was like I'm a 1st level or I'm a 2nd level elf in
Mhm.
AD&D.
Right.
And what is my character background? Well, my character background of my second level elf is that before I was a first level elf,
Right.
right? Like, the concept of a character's narrative was just something that you discovered at the table. It wasn't something that you discussed with your DM and talked about and fit into the game world. It's just like, okay, I'm just a vagabond. I'm a murder hobo, and combat was much simpler back then.
Right. Right.
And now, as we're going forward, combat is much more complex, and you have all these nitty gritty mechanics. And now, conversation about the game is, what can my character do? It's not what has my character done. If you go and read, back in the early days of the internet on some of the early chat rooms or some of the early forums that started talking about this stuff back when second edition was just and it's air quote prime. um People would talk about, oh, did you run that module, how did you solve the problems? It was never what is my level 20 epic multi-class crazy warlock paladin build.
Right. Right.
It just didn't come up.
With that in mind, would you say that of those two portraits being painted, kind of this is one of those more grounded than the other in terms of or maybe they're just differently grounded, but I guess maybe that's starting to get to kind of the root of why I say so much of your content harkens back to those early days where to be completely cliche, it seemed like a simpler time back then in terms of that space.
As far as grounding, I'm not really sure if that changes anything. I guess what I'm getting at here is when you add more mechanics to a thing, then people will talk about those mechanics. But then when you watch live plays, like when you watch Dimension 20 or Critical Role or ACK Incorporated, the stuff that people go to watch that for is not the combat encounters.
Right.
It's the social interaction.
Absolutely.
And back before that stuff got injected into the game, that's what people discussed about between games. It was, how did you, even though your character didn't have a backstory, it wasn't like some sort of, long form dramatic improv with dice, which we can talk more about that later. Yeah. It's interesting now that the current zeitgeist of Dungeons and Dragons is focused on the crunch in one aspect, but then the rules where they are quiet, that is where people are having the organic discussion or people are having the organic fun, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
Which
I think that a lot of the actual play space are playing, and when you consider the rule set as an entirety, kind of the way you've been pointing out, they're playing some of the least 5th edition versions of 5th edition you could ever play. I mean,
100%,
because
it doesn't even look like Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. And I think that, honestly, probably that space has garnered some criticism from I don't even know if you want to call it the old school crowd, because it is such a departure from. It's almost like what game you're not playing 5th edition. We can look at the rules and we know you're not playing 5th edition. I mean, they are, but and again, our actual play, I think, is in this exact same space as well. I mean, we absolutely take all sorts of liberties in the space where, quite frankly, the rules haven't even told you what to do with that content. And I completely agree that kind of all of the crunch that's been added to combat, there's almost this desire through gameplay to get back to a rule set that doesn't have all of that injected into it by way of kind of the combat bloating. But for some reason, many people are remaining with that system, despite the fact that it may not be by rules delivering the content that they're really after in their gameplay sessions.
Right. Yeah. A lot of it, I think, is just 5th edition is for sale in Target and Walmart.
Yeah, oh,
You know?
definitely. I mean, it's
And
certainly the
if you
gateway
Google,
Dungeons and
yeah,
Dragons, I think.
it's the gateway. So, a lot of people try to hack 5th edition because it's not just what they know, but it's also what their friends know.
That's a big
And
part of it, absolutely.
which is something that I hear complaints about in the video game industry, that like people, the developers want to make a game that is different from what's already on the market. And people who are very analytical of market trends in the video game industry, they're like, we want to make the next Fortnite, right?
Right.
Like, we want to make the next StarCraft 2, which nobody makes a RTS anymore. That's a ludicrous statement. But that kind of understanding, it's like, if I were a video game company and I were to make the next Fortnite, well, not only do I have to sell you so hard on my Fortnite version 2,
Right.
I have to sell you so hard on it to get you to stop playing Fortnite. I have to get you sold so bought in that you have to get not just you, but all of your friends that you play with to come to the new platform as well.
Right.
And that's just an insurmountable task.
Yeah.
That's insurmountable.
Yeah.
So, now, I feel like a lot of dungeon masters who, get a little bit of experience with 5th edition might feel like that, there's something wrong, which is why they start hacking the rules apart.
Yeah.
But they have a fear that their players won't show up if they want to pivot to a new game system,
right,
which I think is ludicrous.
And I have seen more and more discussion coming from, and the reason I half tongue in cheek, but part of the reason I say it's the gateway is because I have seen more and more discussion throughout social media of people who their first point of contact with Dungeons and Dragons was 5th edition, and through some other group of friends or through some other avenue got to sit down at an earlier edition table and went, wow, this is I think there's a lot of people who just assume that or make a lot of assumptions about what those older systems are, and that they for some reason won't be able to deliver the experience that that they have seen through various actual plays, and in many regards they might actually be better poised to deliver those experiences, rules as
100%. Yes.
And now we did touch a little bit on kind of combat as a major entity in 5th edition. So since we're talking about combat, let's talk a little bit about grounding combat within your games. And it's interesting, one of your videos, and I think you were even telling me that you've done some thumbnail switches around. So I'm not positive what the exact title and thumbnail was of the video. But in the video, you are discussing a real life battle between the English and the French.
The Battle of Agincourt. Yes.
Yep. The Battle of Agincourt. And so that, I guess my first question, and for anyone who's in the space where they're going, I've got every fantastical beast at my fingertips. I can make gravity cease to exist at any moment. I can do anything I want in this space. Why would you advocate looking at an example that is so grounded? And that's not to say I'm not disagreeing with it. I thought I got a lot out of that video. Right. But I would like to hear in your own words why that's such a potent example to make combat interesting.
So that battle specifically is interesting because each, like, we can get into the particulars of the Battle of Agincourt, but the English, because of poor tactics and planning earlier on in the campaign, they didn't have a strong contingent of horse riding knights showing up to the battlefield. In fact, they had so few knights, mounted cavalry, that they decided it was better to dismount and try to hold a defensive line at the top of the hill and leave their horses back at the camp. Gotcha. Right? Like, they just knew that against French cavalry, who, the French horses are stronger, healthier, better fed, taller. Right. Like, the French cavalry are just better than English cavalry in just about every way. Right. They have better armor. So they're just like, we're not even going to try. We're gonna figure something else out. Um, it created a very a mixed unit puzzle that
I like
the
that.
English were able to solve, and the French thought that just because they had the sheer numbers, they didn't understand just how screwed they were in that battle. Like there was definitely a lot of mismanagement on the French side that contributed to the English victory in Agincourt, but you know, failure to wait for reinforcements. If the French had just retreated back 500 yards, they would
Right.
have still held the English at the top of the hill just fine. If they had waited 3 more days, they would have had an entire another 30,000 cavalry that would have like they could have encircled the entire hill
Right. Right.
effectively, you know. Um, but the impetuous, bold nature, the egotistical nature of some of the upper nobilities, like you get a bunch of counts on the battlefield, and newsflash, there was no king there, so there was nobody to like beat them into line. It was just like who had the oldest family, who had the most battle prestige. They were all vying for battle prestige.
Right.
Nobody wanted to be, everybody wanted to be the guy who ruined the English. So they just said, they're shooting arrows at us. Let's go get them.
Yeah.
Rather than thinking through what the English were clearly doing at the top of the hill.
Right. Right. Right.
Planting a bunch of barricades, building small palisade stake walls, like, you know, they didn't even need infantry because the weather was so crappy. The French didn't realize just how the battle was lost as soon as it started, effectively.
Right. Right.
So, I think the big takeaway from that is, when you look at a bizarre, decisive battle, especially when there was an underdog or when there was a very bizarre use of like mixed units, when the battle is entirely lopsided,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you come to a place where you see there is a puzzle that is happening on the battlefield, and when one side loses the puzzle, morale drops and the surviving soldiers rout. Like, and a lot of people scoff to hear me say this, but medieval combat was really not that deadly. You were far more likely to die from like dysentery, disease, or malnourishment than you were actually on the battlefield.
Gotcha.
Far more
Gotcha.
likely to die from that. So it was a morale game,
Right. Right.
right? So I'm not saying that death didn't happen; it absolutely did. But compare combatant fatality rate to the Hundred Years' War to the World War One, it doesn't even
Doesn't
compare.
even compare. Right. Right.
Doesn't even compare. So by looking at the puzzle of an interesting battle like that, you can really start to identify strategies you can take away and think through, like, okay, what would happen, like what's actually going on, not at a tactical level. Like you looking at it at a tactical level, you see that you know the archers are building palisade stake walls in front of their ranks. They make sure that it's just narrow enough to where horses can't get through, but the infantry can still get through if they struggle through it. And that lets them be more mobile. The
Right.
archers
Right.
be more mobile on the battlefield later on in the battle. Like they thought through all of that. So like what are the little aspects, what are the little things that you can pick apart, what are all the little building blocks of this puzzle that made the battle turn out the way it was, and how can you use fantastical elements to just create a drop-in replacement,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, I
So
love your framing of combat, and actually, I'm finding even as we're having this conversation, how that notion of the puzzle, not in the arcadey, chintzy, pull the right combination of levers sense, but
right,
in the kind of brain teaser, how can I make more of what I have than seems possible. But I love that framing in combat um, as a puzzle. I think a lot of what you said there too is also an it's also advocating something you touched on earlier in that this idea that there's also tons of room. Like everything you're describing about their preparations for this battle, all of those in 5th edition fall to the skills list, not to your combat related.
Or to the spellcasters.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. But you described a ton of utility being implemented prior to arrows being drawn, prior to swords being unsheathed. That played obviously a major role by implementing utility and thinking forward, 5-6 turns in advance. And I'm not saying turns in the Dungeons and Dragons sense, but kind of in the chess master sense of that by implementing utility now that's going to be valuable, may not be valuable, maybe even is a taxation on your resources now, but is going to pay dividends later on. Certainly in the scheme of moving those puzzle pieces around to be the force that comes out on top, I think you make a really strong case both for thinking about things in a more I'm drawing a blank for the word I actually want to use, but conceptualizing things as a puzzle rather than just here's 2 guys, they're going to hack at each other until one of them falls over with 0 hit points.
Like, I feel like that's, in the software development community, they call it a code smell. It's like, this looks like smelly code. That's your D&D combat smell right there.
Yes.
If you ever have a combat where players butt heads and exchange licks, or excuse me, where like an NPC and a player, like if you've got the owlbear and it lines up rank and file with the tank in the party, and then the rogue gets behind them for the flank attacks, and they just sit there and exchange licks, you're doing it wrong. Yeah. Like, something needs to dynamically change on the battlefield every turn so that the puzzle is adjusted and the players have to solve a problem every turn. Otherwise, like, just make a combat check.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Make a combat check, take 20% of your hit points away, and now we cut to the end and you killed the owlbear. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of framing it and simplifying it into that combat check space. I mean, seems probably doesn't even seem, is flat out derogatory for those types of encounters, but rightly so. I think, why play through 6 turns of just hacking each other apart? And I love the idea of updating the puzzle on a round by round or turn by turn basis, and remembering as DMs that, especially if you're running any form of intelligent adversary, they are looking at that turn by turn just like the players are, and they've got a vested interest in their own well-being. Their interest is not, man, I really hope that these guys kill me quickly so they can get on to the next plot point,
Right.
I do think actually there is probably this is something that DMs dispense with pretty rapidly, but I think it's a pitfall that you can get into if you as a DM are more invested in your party getting on to your next cool plot point than actually engaging in a meaningful combat.
And to that end, you should cut out anything that doesn't add narrative. Like your random encounters should be curated to the point where they all add narrative in some way, or could add narrative.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So, I'm not meaning to interrupt you here, but like, that's basically, just if you find yourself caring more about getting to the next plot point, why are you even doing the combat in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. One other, and we'll make this a quick touch because there's a couple other bullet points that I'm hoping that we can get to. But in the scope of combat, and it was a video I really, it was one of the messages that was just like, it's again, when you say it, it's so obvious, but I actually think it's something that is egregiously, criminally under-discussed, is the aspect of the CR system and combat scaling, and kind of how antithetical that is to creating we're talking about a living world. And I can walk down the street. If I knock on the next 10 houses, 6 of those guys are going to be able to beat my ass. Like I don't just get stronger because I'm knocking on a power lifter's door. You know,
Right. Right.
so but talk with me a little bit about that, because that video really hit home, you know, and again, cleverly disguised as an encounter balancing video. I love that the takeaway is stop trying to balance your fucking encounters. And
Yeah.
so talk with me a little bit about that, because I think it's something that bears repeating, especially for new DMs, because as you say, CR is now baked in to
Right.
and kind of an
Well,
expected part of balancing. I think it's one of the systems that does the least for you as a dungeon master, and
I would
absolutely
agree.
undermines your attempts to create meaningful encounters, some of which
Right.
require fleeing from combat for the players if it is a meaningful and grounded space.
Absolutely. So, and I got a lot of flack in the comments saying, "Oh, well, scaling encounters was definitely considered in the earlier editions. There were sections on it in the second Dungeon Master." Like, yes, it was definitely discussed, but not at the painstaking level of detail that it's currently discussed.
Right.
They had older editions had what was called the effective hit dice, where you looked at the hit dice that the monster had, and depending on the system, you either rolled a D8, a D10, or a D12 for the actual HP based on those hit dice.
Right.
And then if it had special abilities, you got a 1 or a 2, sometimes maybe a 3 asterisk after the hit dice. And the number of stars or asterisks after the hit die number, that was what you added to get the effective hit die. And you used that as a means to like gauge the power level. And it was just kind of expected, like, don't throw a 7 hit die dragon at your first level party.
Right.
Some of these things are just right? Like, you
Yeah.
just don't try to engage in direct combat with players at 7th level with a freaking dragon. But outside of that, it was loose enough to where you could gauge health in a healthy way. Like, okay, that's how powerful this monster is,
Right.
and that was all you needed.
Yeah.
You didn't need run all these calculations to determine uh you know how much, like, what was the determine its AC and its attack dice, or its attack damage every round or every
Right.
3
Right.
rounds if it's got like mixed abilities. You don't Waste of time.
Yeah.
Waste of time.
Yeah. And
Especially when we're dealing with monsters who have abilities that are designed not even for combat. It's
right. And
even more
I
a
think
waste
you
of
even
time.
touched on that video
I
that,
did.
you can take a relatively low CR creature, but if you are
Mhm.
running it intelligently in its home environment where it's honed its skills through thousands of years of evolution, and it can climb on sheer rock faces where the party cannot. So I mean, that CR rapidly just means nothing.
Nothing.
And I think, I mean, however effective or ineffective the CR system is, it still begs the question: why would you want to set the precedent for your players that every room they walk into is an achievable win? That's a really bad precedent, I think, to set as in terms of building tension into the space, and in terms of saying, again, this is a living world where that dragon, we'll keep with your example, that dragon
Right.
is in there, and there's nothing about my world, unless I'm going to railroad them, that says at level 1 they can't forge their way to its lair. It's a bad idea. No two ways about
So,
it.
I think that it's this is a little bit of a chicken and egg in our argument, but I really think it stems from, because this really started to emerge in 3rd edition when, action RPG and MMORPGs started to invade the think tank of, the general game design community.
Right.
And in those games, even though you definitely don't have, auto scaling monsters the same way you do in Skyrim now, for example,
Right.
or
Right.
but when you played in an MMO, you cleared all the stuff in the room, cleared all the stuff in the level, and then you moved on to the next level, and you got powerful, and the monsters got more powerful.
Right.
And that created this, it was a very linear way to tell a story, because programming a video game is just easier when it's done that
Oh,
way.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it generally makes for a more enjoyable experience when things are just progressively a little harder every time. It makes the player feel good.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done that way in a tabletop RPG, and it doesn't necessarily mean that video games should be doing that in the first place,
Right.
you know? So it's just one of those things. It's like I think people have grown up, in this new cadre of, young millennials and Gen Z especially. They've grown up playing those games from the
Absolutely.
very
Absolutely.
beginning, and that has baked in that expectation.
Yeah.
It's just baked in as a cultural experience.
Yeah. Well,
So,
I think it reinforces the, let's say, combat centricity of modern Dungeons and Dragons. If you know that every room you enter in, combat is a viable solution by scale.
Is the most viable.
Well, okay,
is the most viable solution.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Contrast that against, you peek into a room and you see some baddies and you're going, wow, these guys look beyond us. Now you're back in that puzzle space of, we have to get to the other side of that room. How do we do it when combat isn't an option? And I think when you've inculcated into a player base at large, the idea that there will never be a creature in a room that is inherently undefeatable by you at your current level of strength, whatever level you happen to be at, that again, that sets players up to begin erasing all of the potential creativity and engaging with the world in a non-combative sense.
100%. Absolutely agree with that.
I love that. And we just kind of hit on players there a little bit. And this is one, the only real ping that I have out of your videos gets over to your high level D&D sucks. And mainly because it talked about some of the inherent power curve structures that are built into kind of the character growth process in 5th edition. And but as a broad or a kind of a general concept, talk with me a little bit about what are things that we can be doing as DMs to, we were talking about grounding our worlds in ways that make them believable. We're talking about grounding our combat encounters, and not just combat. Really, I think that extends to any kind of encounter that you're having. Should we be concerned with, and if so, what can we or should we be doing to help our players be more grounded at our tables? Is that something that we should even be concerned about? I ask this because I think those power curves you talked about do feel very artificial in the context of a grounded world with a grounded narrative and grounded encounters.
So when you say grounded, what exactly do you mean by that in this context? Are you saying, in a low fantasy type of
I think
way, or
certainly I think that has something to do with it. I think, again, when you're looking at a level 20 PC, the things they're capable of doing, I would say, are anything but grounded. And
sure,
and
they're wildly fantastical.
Yeah. And so I guess, and you have kind of everything in between, and I think old school D&D kind of had a much better sense of the realism of the character arc that your character was going to move through. It wasn't, I start out as I'm a farmer heading on out, or I guess in 5th edition, more appropriately, you're a farmer who happened to get secret training from a shady organization in the use of a blade, and now that's how your level 1 starts. But you effectively are a guy with a sword, and come the end, you are a demigod for all intents and purposes. That there's such a good opportunity to lose a sense of gravity, a sense of your feet on the ground in that space. Is that something we should care about as DMs? Should we just go, well, they're going to get there and that is what it is? And again, is it even a problem that happens?
I think the problem is more that you've got characters who start off as simple farmers in a backwater village in the middle of nowhere, and they barely know how to hold a sword and sling a spell. I mean, 5th edition, they definitely are more powerful than that. But, you know, let's say that they start there. Okay, by the time they get to 5th level, even, like once they get access to 3rd level spells, like a wizard can just walk into any thatched roof village and just destroy it. Gone.
And
No
some
problem.
do, and some do.
Yeah, like fireball,
Yeah.
fire, you get the druid there with you, fireball, flaming sphere, scorching ray, burning hands 6 times, you're done.
Yeah.
The whole village is completely burned down. And that's something that you just can't reasonably do with a that's something you just can't really reasonably do at 1st level. So I think something that the Dungeon Master's Guide is really poor about walking a new DM through is understanding like how to make a narrative shift happen from these are the small problems your character is going to have at 1st through 4th, 1st through 3rd level, and what kind of narrative you just have to change and pivot to, because you can't. I mean, I guess you can. There are some closets and stuff like that, but it's really hard to tell a compelling story and solve problems about like extraplanar creatures that your players get introduced to at an early level and make sense at level 15 as like a foundational storytelling in those early levels,
Right.
if
Right.
that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
And that's part of the problem with 5th edition is that, or with narrative storytelling, I should say, not 5th edition. Part of it is exemplified by 5th edition, but like, part of good narrative design is you lay the ground rules for what is real, what are the constraints of this fantasy
Yes.
at this lower level. And then, in levels 1 through 2 in your first couple of game sessions, and then that sets up all the framing for the levels thereafter. So, when you are level 1 and you get introduced to this big bad necromancer, by the time you're level 7, 8, 9, you can pretty much handle it.
Right.
You can at least be smart about it and handle it.
Right.
And, a necromancer is really scary and tangible at level 1, but like, how do you the problems that a level 15, level 20 character can solve are so eldritch and so just cosmic in scope,
Right.
that they would be literally mind-blowing to a 1st level character who just doesn't even have anywhere near the capacity
Right.
to do something with that.
And I think
So
that really is illustrating kind of and like I said, I think it's a tough problem to solve if you're going to just run with 5th edition rules as written. But when and I really liked you touched on narrative structure, because that actually pivots into the next space well, but that kind of all of the hallmarks of a well-structured narrative, if you were to try and graft that across a campaign, and maybe this is made up of a series, well, not maybe, it will be made up of a series of smaller narratives that build into kind of the ultimate climax, that that gets, if you were to graft that general arc for the broad narrative of your campaign, and then graft over that the power arc of the party, those graphs would not lay well over one another in terms of,
or at least it's very hard to understand how to do correctly when you're a new dungeon master.
Yes.
It's like the scope of the story is just so much,
right,
that like, where's the advice in the dungeon master that says, how about you try and run a campaign that goes to like level 6 first, and then drop back and do it again and go to like level 10.
Absolutely.
Like that advice doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it should. It really should.
Yeah.
Just for those reasons.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it, that a bite-sized chunk of the broader character development arc, from a mechanical standpoint, really grafts well onto what we think of as grounded narrative structure. So
Right.
I love that you hit that. And you could probably take any chunk. I think you even hit on this in your video, is like, why not start running a campaign for experienced players at level 11?
Yeah. Why
That's
not?
such an exciting space, and you don't run into the narrative scaling issues of going, can you please go get that cheese wheel for me, sir? The mice have taken my cheese. From that to, there are gods conspiring against reality itself. Can you manage that for us?
Right.
It's just such a chasm to clear. But 11 to 20, instead of starting out fetching cheese wheels and fighting rats in cellars, you can be doing 11th level meaningful things, working up to.
Right. You can start doing the extra planar travel.
Right,
You've got
right.
the ability to do that.
Yeah. So
So
I
yeah.
love that you touched on that. And like I said, pivoting into the narrative structure, because I think narrative is one of those things. And I guess to kind of define my thinking of grounded narrative,
Hmm.
I think that whatever it is in our DNA that even makes us, I don't want to say makes us, that compels us or inclines us to sit around tables and tell stories like these. There's something primordial, there's something ancient about that communion, that exchange, that very likely has been taking place as long as we have been a species capable of verbal communication.
For sure. Yeah.
And I think whether it's just through our narrative socialization, the types of films and books that we grow up with, or if it's something, again, more ingrained in us as a species, there is an aspect of a way in which we want to consume narratives that feels satisfying, that when we
Right.
get to the end of that arc, if the right components were in place, that feels like a satisfying, compelling conclusion to a story. So I guess that's kind of that sense of, wow, that was a great story. How tethered do you think that is? I tend to think of narrative structure, kind of your classic
Hmm.
3-act structure, beginning, middle, end, rising action, climax, falling, that kind of general structure as being such a foundationally grounding element for narratives. Where is your head at in that space? Would you agree that is the case? And I guess in your stories, the stories that you're telling at your tables, you and your players, how important is it that our narratives are grounded in those ways, if at all?
So I think over time, you will find yourself that you have a more compelling story when you are using typical narrative tropes. That doesn't necessarily have to mean it's the 3-act structure.
Right.
But these kinds of tropes are there for a reason. It's nobody just sat down and said, I'm going to think up this trope and we're going to just use it. No, it's something that organically happens over time.
Right.
Like Hollywood even has a term for this in their screenwriting called the page 80 crash, where if you have, a 90-minute blockbuster on page 80 of the script or, thereabout, you're going to have something that happens that is like super pivotal and weird and completely changes the scope of the story. It's that the recontextualization of things that the characters already knew.
Right.
Now they understand it in a different way, and it happens on page 80. And these tropes exist because they just organically manifest in a good story, right? So, you can say that, like, you can even lay the Shakespearean 5-act structure over top of the 3-act structure, and it basically lines up with like all the things that are happening
Right.
there,
Right.
right? Um, so, with that said, I think a good story will have it organically come about because you are providing lore and interest to your players over time as they explore the world, like we talked about in the Riven video. But like, if you just let your players bumble around and slowly piece together parts of the story, eventually they will bump into the thing that suddenly makes all these other things that they were confused about make sense. Well,
Right.
guess what? That's, you had your rising action, that's your client, or that's your recontextualization, situation there in Act
Absolutely.
2.
Yep.
And now you spend, okay, now we finally figured it out. Now we got to go get, or we got to rush to go get the other MacGuffins because there's this time crunch now that's pressing on us now that we understand what the time crunch is.
Right.
Now we need to go solve the problems and get the thing done to stop the big bad. And those kinds of things just organically come about. But once you start to see them as a dungeon master, you can start structuring where certain MacGuffins are, where certain points of lore are, where they have access, or the players have access
Right.
to them.
Right.
You can start to control that. So as the players start to move about and bump into the various things, you can move the MacGuffins around where that makes sense. So that as far as like on the fourth dimensional, on the time dimensional, as the players play through the game, the timing is right so that the players bump into those things.
Right. Right.
And you'll start to identify, just as an aside, like one of the best things a dungeon master, especially a new one, can do is to play as many like first through fifth level or first through sixth level, maybe seventh level is probably good, but play through as many first through seventh level as campaigns as you can, even like doubling the amount of XP so that you can get through those first 7 levels
Right. Right.
as
Right.
quickly as possible. Like, level up every week, or level up every combat encounter or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. Um, so just so you can get a lot of experience really quick at disseminating the lore, providing the right clues to the right people at the right time,
Yes.
and having it all thread together on that timing, right? That's
Right.
that's the key. How many encounters do I need in order to let the players explore this thing and then this thing? And then they get to the third encounter where it recontextualizes all these other things. They understand the thing better. Now they can solve the problem.
Right. Right.
Um,
Well, I love that you
and
touched on time there too, because it wasn't
right,
something that I had marked down for this conversation, but certainly from a narrative perspective, I mean, time is, I would say you could have a phenomenally well structured narrative that if it plays out over the span of a single session, the entire narrative, you've lost a lot of opportunity to inject meaning and weight into those actions. So I mean, I love that you hit on time there because it wasn't something that
right,
I had in my notes to discuss about. So
right. But so kind of looping back to like knowing the timing of like when to disseminate those things. Um, Something that I'd mentioned to you to go watch before we had the stream, just so we
yep,
could talk about it.
yes,
Middleditch and Schwartz's long form improv series on Netflix.
yep, and
If
which
you're
I was
stumbling into this video and you're not watching this, viewers, go watch. Pause the video, go watch that
yeah.
now, and then come back. Okay,
I'll
we're
second that.
back.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're back. Okay, so something that like I would really like to drive home here is that you don't have to know exactly where you're going in order to know that you need the thing that can be recontextualized later.
yes,
And this is
okay, I love that.
really made exemplified by Middleditch and Schwartz's first episode. And I find it to be one of their strongest because it was very clear that one of the two partners they weren't comfortable with not knowing. They didn't feel like they had an anchor point with the story. And if just to summarize the story, spoiler alert,
Well, they've already
you
watched it.
know,
If they followed
yeah,
directions, they've already watched it.
they've
So
already watched it. Yeah, spoiler alert. So they improv a story about a man who is getting married to a woman, and there's a man in the audience, or a man who is friends with the wife to be or the bride to be, who had a prior romance, and basically I can't remember all of the details, had a prior romance with the bride, and it becomes like this three-way or this love triangle
Yeah.
at the altar.
Yeah.
But about halfway through the sketch, one of the actors just out of nowhere comes up with this ghost character and just throws a ghost in. He's like,
Yes.
I didn't he
Yep.
and he's I recognize that he does this because he's struggling to figure out how to get like they can't the actors cannot communicate with each other.
Right.
But he knows that he is struggling to figure out to how to get these two disparate storylines that are happening with the bride, the groom, and the groom's best or excuse me, the bride's best
Bride's
friend that
ex,
has
yeah.
that still is in love, the ex. He's trying to figure out how to get them all to stitch together.
Right.
And he knows that if he just throws something weird out there, this ghost, it's gonna be something that the two of them can riff on later in order to bring everything together.
Right. Right.
So, you start to hear this, oopsie doopsie story about how and one of the characters has this dark past and accidentally shoots a clown, and shooting the clown ends their relationship. This sounds like I'm talking about a dream. But it's only because that ghost is there that the dead clown is able to come back and like tie the story together.
Right. Right.
So, and because of that, you get that recontextualization of the rising action.
Yep.
Then you finally have the climax there at the altar where the ghost shows up at the altar, like he's been lurking around in the wedding.
Right.
Why is the ghost here?
Yep.
Now it all makes sense. They were able to stitch it all together for an absolutely phenomenal story. And I hear a lot of people complain in the comments that, oh, it's improv and the dungeon master doesn't know where the story's going. Bullshit.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think the idea that we're walking into every session completely blind to what the world has been doing this whole time. I mean, if we aren't cognizant of what the world is doing, who is?
Exactly.
So I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah. So, if you're, you should have ideas of like where the story is going to end. That should be clear to you in order to have a satisfying campaign ending.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just going to fizzle out. Right. Yeah. It's just going to fizzle out. People are going to get bored. They're going to stop bringing drinks. They're going to stop bringing pizza, and then they're going to stop bringing themselves.
Right.
So people will get bored if you don't have a way to come to a climactic ending. So just throw a random MacGuffin in there. If you're out of ideas, like the players are off doing something that I don't understand and I can't get them back on track, just throw a MacGuffin at him, watch them struggle with it, and then be like, oh, that's the like, 'cause their paranoid conjecture across the table will help you link everything back together. You just got to give them something to be paranoid about.
I love that you hit that, because something I was talking about with an outfit, Nerd Night News, and we were talking about resources that you can lean on as a DM, and one that I think isn't talked about near enough are your players in session. When you provide them something like you're talking about, this MacGuffin that you provided them, their speculation as to what this might mean. There are times where my player's speculation is so good. It's not what I intended. It's not what I had in my mind.
Right.
It's so good though that I go, I think that is what that is. They're right. They're totally, whatever it is. There's that, you got 3, 4, 5 brains cooking away at what they see in front of them. Don't let that just dissipate as heat. Don't let that be an entropic 100%. Waste.
Yes.
Grab some of those
That's
things.
That's a great word, entropic waste.
and use them. So I can't second that enough. And I do think that for those who aren't great at following directions, who are still watching this and didn't go jump over to Netflix, it actually, I think it's a great representation of DMing on the fly. They're not running a game, obviously. But
no, they're not. But what's the difference? They just don't have dice in classes,
right?
Right.
And I think
and the DM for that matter.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for stripping those things away, and you can see in a really short time, given the most cursory of prompts from some audience members, how you can tell a very compelling story completely on the fly. utilizing the tools you were talking about, by knowing where you're trying to get, and by allowing those aspects of the story to kind of bubble to the surface organically. Yeah, I think I'm hugely appreciative that you pointed me in the direction. Again, I was totally green going into that series, and that it really is I think it's a great place for anyone who's interested in improv in general, but certainly the
Right.
improvisational aspects of telling stories as a dungeon master. It's a great resource to look at and be able to kind of see what it is that they're doing in that space, and arguably a space that is far more a space that is far less forgiving than us sitting at our tables, because
Oh, absolutely.
their time scale, we might have months or years by which to unspool these narratives, where we've got a week, 2 weeks in between sessions to think heavily on what's transpired and how we're
Right.
tying these things together. They're doing it over the course of an hour and a half, or I don't remember exactly how long. Maybe it was an hour.
Yeah, but they're doing it not only over the course of an hour, they're doing it over the course of an hour where they're not allowed to, like, formally, like, moose antlers out of character talk
Right.
about it for a second, nor and they're doing it in front of a live studio audience.
Yeah.
So,
It's
it's extremely brutal,
yeah.
and if they can make it work, we as dungeon masters can make it work.
Yes.
So
I love that, and I think just to kind of summarize, I love what you said about allowing those narrative points to develop organically, and I think if we've kind of put our minds in the headspace of some of the ways in which through your work you have established some really strong templates for how we can kind of ground, again, through grounding our worlds, our encounters, that by having a fertile ground by which these elements can come to the surface,
Mhm.
that intrinsically those narratives that are going to develop from the surface will be born of a living world, a grounded world, born of exciting, grounded encounters. And like I said, I think you packaged in true dungeon masterpiece fashion. I think you packaged the narrative side of things very, very neatly. I know we're kind of getting into the end of our time here, and I always like to take an opportunity to give whoever I'm sitting down with a chance to just talk about whatever it is they're working on, whatever it is they're hyped about.
I've got one more point I'd like to add here, just to kind of loop back around.
Do it.
So we were talking about, how I was saying it's kind of a logical fallacy to think of the three aspects of, the three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons. Part of, something I plan on talking about more in a more cohesive, structured episode is returning back to this combat idea, like looking at historical battles for combat.
Right.
And like, just because you're in a combat encounter doesn't mean that you can't use concepts of narrative, that you can't use concepts of the social mechanic in combat either.
I love it.
And what's really fun, and I want to do a deeper analysis of the Battle of Hastings. So just to kind of summarize it here really quick. You've got the Normans, who have a bunch of light cavalry, and it's one of the first times, at least the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, that cavalry had been transported across the English Channel, if I understand correctly. I may be wrong on that, but William the Conqueror loaded a bunch of cavalry onto a ship, and it was the first time that it had ever been done, and is he Saxon king? Oh Lord, I can't remember, the English Saxon king that was there on the throne.
Okay.
He had lined up his housecarls in a line on a hill in between two forests. Here we go again.
Yeah.
You've got a barricaded line, shield wall at the top of a hill in between two forests, and there's a marsh down below, right? Except, what was the difference of this battle? It should have gone toward King Harold's favor.
Right.
You know, if you look at it from the Agincourt perspective, it's basically the exact same terrain. Cavalry at the bottom, you know, infantry at the top of the hill. Sure, they didn't have longbows, but they were throwing slings, they were throwing axes at them. But the cavalry did something really different that the French did not do. They rode up to the top of the hill, and if you're familiar with Norman cavalry, why it's interesting to call them light cavalry, even though by definition they were heavy, they were armored. They had kite shields, which is to say that the shield went down the full length of their arm and to a point, and that point at the bottom of the shield covered the hindquarters of the horse. Well, why in the world would you need a shield that would cover the hindquarters of your horse if you were on a full frontal charge with a lance? It just doesn't happen.
Right.
You know, like that's not an area of risk and not worth the added weight, right? You would be using a different kind of shield for that problem. Well, it was because the the cavalry doctrine of the Normans was to charge at the enemy as hard as you possibly could, throw lances, throw javelins at them, throw spears at them, turn around, thereby exposing the horse's hindquarters, and haul ass back to go get another bundle of javelins or to fish another javelin out, and you just cycled like this, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of historians theorize, because we don't have good evidence of it, but the one of the leading theories about the Battle of Hastings is that the infantry, even though they technically were winning the battle by, you know, their shield wall was relatively impervious to all these cavalry attacks, they just became so frustrated with the fact that they couldn't get any licks on the Norman cavalry themselves in any meaningful capacity,
Right.
that they broke rank when the Norman cavalry were doing a tactical retreat. They broke rank and started chasing down the hill, eliminating the shield wall.
Right.
Well, as soon as that happens, that's when the Norman cavalry draw swords, they turn around and just mop everything up because there's no defense. Full charge.
Yeah.
Just stampede through everything.
I love it.
You know, how do you apply that to a Dungeons and Dragons mechanic? Well, wouldn't it be absolutely hilarious if the plan of the players was to have like this really tactical, like, okay, the paladin's gonna sit here, the fighter's gonna sit here, things are gonna, you know, we're gonna hold a defensive line, and then you get one big badass sitting at the other end who just starts hauling off all kinds of nasty vitriolic comments, throws something nasty at them, just throws a spear at them, calls them a coward, and runs away. You really think your 5th level fighter is just going to stand there and take it? No, he's going to chase him down. Yeah. You know, he's going to, I'm not a coward, you know. And all of a sudden, you've left the wizard exposed, and here comes, you know, an orc on a warg or something like that to just mop up the wizard out, you know, because he held his action out from behind a boulder. So,
I love that I mean, that's a great tie-in for what you were talking about injecting those social elements into your injecting the other pillars that are not combat into that space,
into the combat, right?
And yeah, I mean, you could easily break the ranks of your PC's party, maybe through just slinging some nasty insults,
yeah.
and you know, so I love it. I actually I will be keeping my eyes peeled for that analysis over on your channel, because that sounds like a really interesting interesting battle to look at, and ways in which we can again think about just new and exciting puzzles that can play out on the battlefield. So I love that. Yeah, like I said, I mean, is there anything that this would be your chance to, any videos that you're really hyped about coming down the pipeline, anything that you're working on in the back? Now, was this just a poll for poll's sake, or is there a chance that we're getting a geopolitics supplement?
No, okay, so that's an interesting thing. It's sort of quasi back burner. I've got an outline written. I've written a few things, but like even for my own like personal career development, I'm actually going to Florida Atlantic University. They have a it's not a grad school, but it is a postgraduate certification.
Gotcha. Okay.
They've partnered with Range Stratfor, which is a geopolitical intelligence group. They're an organization that provides as a service geopolitical risk analysis for corporate and government entities.
Okay, gotcha.
And so I'm getting a certification with them for geopolitical strategy, and I've kind of held back. You'll notice that I've actually been really quiet about talking about geopolitics on my channel, just because I realize that 2 months from now I'll have a much more crystallized methodology of analyzing this once I've completed the certification.
Gotcha. Okay.
So rather than just being an armchair historian, I really hope and believe that this will add a lot of analytical tools and further add much more value to those episodes. And that is to say that I'm also kind of back burnering working on a geopolitical world building book, like not like a, you know, it's not going to be like a Tasha's Cauldron of world building.
Right.
It will be like an actual, like, I'll probably do an audible release of it, like, you know, paperback press release book, right? Yeah. But so that's definitely in the works. I've got a few ideas for, you know, Rivers Around the World is kind of a working title right now.
Well, I love the Rivers video. I thought
there
was some great insights about ways that you could utilize. I mean, rivers. Really, I mean, you could run an entire campaign just off this one river and its significance in the region. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
But yeah, so I'm working on that book, getting the certification. So, and like once that happens, I'm probably going to go ham wild on doing all kinds of campaign settings and a geopolitical analysis. So, you know I've got Eberron stacked next. I'll probably do Dragonlance.
Love it. I'm stoked for Eberron. Eberron is going to be a very interesting.
It'll be interesting for me because I think it'll be really interesting from a geopolitical breakdown perspective, but I personally very much dislike Eberron.
Okay. So it'll be a double-edged sword for you to handle. Huh?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'll come away with a new appreciation for it. Okay. But then, so those are the two big ones that I'll probably be. Oh, and Galarian. I get a lot of requests for Galarian.
Really?
I find a lot of Pathfinder people watch my content, which is cool. You know, I didn't think that they'd be so interested in it. Cool. I find that the Pathfinder people I find to be, you know, very very into like the crunch and the you know, the mechanics of the game, and that's why they play Pathfinder.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess everybody wants to build an effective world. I just find it really interesting that there's such a strong population of people interested in Galarian. So that's coming down the pike. What else is going on? That's about it. Oh, I've got a book I'm working on with another YouTuber, Sigurd, over at Beltenbauer Club.
Okay.
He and I are putting together something. It's kind of a action RPG, dark fantasy, 90s video game, Diablo-esque style feeling. And that's kind of what we were going for. That's what I had in my mind's eye. But Sigurd is designing, spreading it out, and doing all the illustration work. And
very cool.
His work is a very phenomenal one, but also really refreshing, and doesn't look anything like what you find in. And I don't think I've seen anything that looks like it.
It's got its own style, a stylistic rework of
it's
that
a
genre.
very different style.
Very cool. And is that going to be a Kickstarter project ultimately?
It will be a Kickstarter.
DM's Guild, or?
No, it'll be a Kickstarter. We'll probably have it on DM's Guild if it funds afterward. I don't think it will have a problem getting it to fund, and you know, we'll probably set whatever the benchmark is to be whatever the cheapest print run is. You know, 1,000 backers will probably be all we need. But
very cool.
So yeah, that'll come out. Our target for it was June. That's not going to happen.
You mean June 2023?
Maybe by the yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe by the end of the year. I'd like to have it wrapped up by Christmas. Awesome. But I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that's worth mentioning? I think that's about it. That's about all we got.
Definitely sounds like some exciting stuff coming in the pipeline. I will be keeping my eye out for the Kickstarter. Once you guys have that live, give me those links and I'll make sure that they're included in this video as well.
Cool. Excellent.
But beyond that, so we have a little tradition here at Modern Myth. We sign all of our videos off with the phrase, "The world is yours." Usually I'm the only one on camera, so I'm the one who's doing it. But if you would be so kind this time, I'll kind of take us out. But in any way, I want the most dungeon masterpiece, "The world is yours," that you can provide, whatever that means. I don't even know what that means, and I'm saying it. So, but hey, we hope you guys got a lot out of this conversation here with Baron Ropp from Dungeon Masterpiece. I know I did. I really appreciate you taking the time to come sit down and let me pick your brain. I've thoroughly enjoyed all the content over on your channel, and I know there's so many times where I'm like, God, I wonder what he thinks about this. I love Riven. I wonder what he thinks about this. Whatever it is. But I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with me, Baron. Beyond that, thank you guys so much for joining us this time. Until next time.
Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters. And until next time, remember, the world is yours.